Hello everyone and welcome to this latest raw umber video. In this hour-long portrait session, I want to focus on, of course, some of the basics of how to draw a portrait, but I also want to focus on the hair and how to draw the hair. For this video, I'm using Willow charcoal, and I'm using a sanding block to sand it open, so opening the grain. And for this, I'm first sanding the side of the charcoal, so as you can see I'm laying it down completely horizontal to open up the side of the charcoal. And I'm also using a slight incline there to create a wedge shape to my charcoal for the details. To blend, I like to use some kitchen roll or a bit of tissue, whatever you have laying around, just to do the big areas of blending. And for the smaller areas of blending, I like to use a hog brush, so quite a stiff brush, or one of these sponge blenders. But of course you can also just use your fingers. As always, all of these materials can be found in the materials box below the video. So the first thing I want to do here is do some measuring. And for this I'm using something called comparative measurements. So the first thing I want to put down on the paper is the widest point of the hair. And for this I'm using the cheekbones as the measuring point, and I make a note of the width of the hair. As you can see, I'm using my blending brush here to use as a marker, and I'm comparing this to the height of the pose. And as you can see, the chin to the top of the head is roughly the same as the width of the hair. Now from here, I can just look at some simple angles to create the shape of the head, including the hair. Now instead of continuing in just line, I'm going to use the side of my charcoal to fill in the whole envelope shape of the pose. And by envelope shape, I basically mean the simple shape in which the pose can fit. And as you can see, I'm not really committing to this. I'm just finding some rough lines that show that the bottom of the hair, for instance, is wider than the top of the head. And once I've got this, I can use my tissue paper or my kitchen roll just to blend this all together to get rid of any textures. Now the point of doing this is that I want to be able to later put in my highlights using rubber. And just to test if I can do that now, I can just take my rubber and try to make a highlight, and as you can see, it's not really pulling any charcoal out. So I'm just going to give this another layer. Now I've done this and I have this grey ground, I can go back to my measurements. So again, coming back to that square, bottom of the chin to top of the head is roughly the same as the sides of the hair. And I can start looking at dividing this further. So for instance, looking at the fringe, I can see that's roughly halfway in between the top of the head and the bottom of the chin. I can also see that the light of the cheekbone is roughly halfway horizontally, so from side to side. So as you can see, I'm working from bigger shapes to smaller shapes. And I like to simplify these a lot. So for instance, looking at the fringe to those cheekbones, I can see that the shape of the face is a sort of inverted triangle. It's wider at the cheekbones and more narrow at the chin. Now looking at these bigger shapes and not getting distracted by stuff like the eyes or anything else that's a smaller shape is a really useful tool at the beginning of a drawing like this, because at this stage we're really just mapping out where everything should be. As you can see right now, I'm doing the same thing for the hair, just adding some larger shapes on top and then filling these in again using the side of my charcoal. So now I've got some of these bigger shapes in, let's break down the face a little bit more. So again, making my measurements a little bit smaller, I'm looking at the halfway point between the chin and the fringe, and I can see that is roughly the bottom of the nose. And this is quite common. The chin to bottom of the nose is often equal to bottom of the nose to brow line, and so that's the next part that I want to start putting in. Now looking at the direction of the brows, I can actually see that they're at a slight angle, so I'm copying over that angle at both the nose, the chin and the top of those brows. Alright, so let's continue to break this down a bit further. Now dividing the nose to the brow into 3/3 gives me the bottom of the eye sockets, and I can really see a nice diagonal there on the outline before the cheekbone starts coming out. Then we can see the cheekbone coming out almost to the tip of the nose and then narrowing down again towards the chin. Now we all have some bias when we're drawing, and it's completely natural and normal. And one way I like to combat this natural bias is by looking at negative shapes. And what I mean by this is that I'm not looking at what I'm actually drawing. Instead, I'm looking at the shape next to it. So for instance, when I'm now putting in the bridge of the nose, instead of looking at the shape of the nose, I'm looking at the distance between the cheekbone and the bridge of the nose. Now, one thing that's really good about working this way, about just looking at shapes and measuring, is that we don't get distracted by our own biases this way. So for instance, normally we overstate how important the face is and so how big the face is, and don't give the model enough space for the top of the head. And just measuring where that fringe is versus the bottom of the chin already corrects that. So it's a really useful way to draw challenging poses like this. Now I've just put in a darker shape just for the eye sockets as a placeholder. And I can see there's a light space in between the eye sockets, so following up from the bridge of the nose. From there, I'm breaking down the eye sockets even more, looking at the arch of the brows, for instance, and not really bothering about stuff like the eyes yet. Again, working big shapes to smaller shapes. So again, not looking at the eyes here. I find squinting really helps because it turns these shadows into just shapes. And in this phase of the drawing, this sort of constructing and measuring phase, what we're really trying to do is set ourselves up for success later on. So later, when we do start to draw the detail, we won't have to worry about it being in the wrong place because we've done the work with the measurements. So this is really the framework of the drawing. Now, something that can happen when we do end up drawing one area like this for a long time is that our eye gets used to the drawing and doesn't see the shapes anymore. So it's also a good idea to jump around the drawing, work 5 minutes here, then 5 minutes there, and bring the whole drawing up to speed this way. So instead of fully developing the eyes, for instance, I'm now jumping around and I'm going to start working on the mouth. Now for this, I like to divide the bottom of the nose to the bottom of the chin into 3 equal parts. And the first part will be the top lip, and the second part will be the bottom of the bottom lip. And again, just looking at shapes here, not outlining the lips, instead squinting and trying to draw in those shadow shapes. Now, something that I find really fascinating about this is that we don't actually need more than these shapes. So for instance, I can just get rid of the line of the nose. And because we've got this nice clear shadow shape underneath the nose, as well as the eye sockets, we don't even miss that line. And the same thing goes for the fringe. So instead of trying to draw hair, trying to add hair textures, I'm just looking at the little light shapes. And again, the same thing for the brow, the smaller triangular shape, just above the top lid. And slowly a face is starting to form just by looking at these triangles and squares and other shapes. Now the reason why this works is because our brain is used to doing this. We're constantly interpreting the world with very little information. So when we see an eye socket shape and a nose shape, our brain immediately interprets that as a face, even though they're just simple shapes. And so we can really use this in the drawing. So let's switch our focus for a second and look at the hair. Now for the hair, again, the natural inclination may be to start drawing wavy lines because of course, as we can see, the model has wavy hair. But this often, again, is our bias. And instead I can look at those shapes again. So for instance, I can see a triangular shape just below the nose, and more of a square shape above that. And again, looking at those negative shapes and the way they measure up. So comparing the cheek to the outline of the hair, for instance, is a really nice way to measure the width and the shapes of the hair. And again, later on we will add more detail to this, but right now we're just measuring and searching for the big framework. So at this point I've got most of my shapes in. I've got a darker tone for the hair and the shadows, and a nice mid-tone for the light skin tones. And what I'm going to do next is look at some edges. And what I mean by edges is just the transition from the shadow into the light. And of course, some forms are really quick to transition and some are really nice and slow. So you can imagine a round object will have a slower transition from the light to the shadow. And a good example of that is of course the cheek. That's a rounded shape, and so I'm going over this with my blending tool and just gently blending the edge of the shadow together with the light to create this soft rounded edge. And we can see this roundness as well, of course, at the bottom of the nose, the tip of the nose into that shadow. And of course as well in the outlines of the lips. So anywhere really where you perceive the shape to be round or rounder. So a soft edge is the first edge, or type of edge I should say. The next one I want to talk about is the lost edge. And this is an area where one tone completely disappears into another. And a good example of that is the eyelash into the hair. Both are really dark, and so instead of outlining these, I'm just letting them disappear. So as you can see at the moment, the tone of the hair is pretty much identical to the tone of the eye and the eyelashes. And so the two shapes merge into one another, and this is called a lost edge. So let's see where else we can find some lost edges, and a very obvious candidate to me is the fringe into the shadows of the brow. I don't really see where the shadow of the fringe ends and the shadow of the brow begins, so this is another area I can add a completely lost edge. And this may feel a little bit uncomfortable at first. The natural inclination will be to want to explain this area, so show where the fringe is versus the brow or the cheekbone. But the reality is that we don't really need that much information, and it actually can make the drawing feel a little bit too cartoonish. So actually losing some areas can really help the drawing. So I've lost some edges around the brow and around the eyes. And for me, the biggest lost edge is the jawline into the hair. Again, very counterintuitive, because surely we need to draw in the whole head to make it feel like a finished portrait. Actually, what I'm gonna do is the opposite. They're both dark shapes. The shadow of the chin is almost as dark as the hair, so I'm just gonna bring these two into one simple tone. So again, completely losing that edge. And what I love about this is that the minute I do this, the focus of the picture shifts. So instead of us looking at the jawline or into the shadows, my eye at least now completely naturally wanders towards the features, and that's where I want the viewer to look. So it's a really nice way to show the viewer where the attention of the picture should go. So I tend to lose areas which I don't think are that important, and I tend to show more shapes where I want the viewer to look. Right, so now we have added some lost edges as well as soft edges to the portrait. And I'm gonna do the same thing for the hair. Now again, the natural inclination will be to put lots of little hairy lines in, maybe with the rubber to add some highlights, maybe follow along the waves of the hair. But this is not actually what the light is doing. With something like highlights, it's really important to look at the pattern. And when we're looking at the fringe, for instance, the highlights follow a horizontal pattern. They start in the middle of the fringe and then go outwards towards the outline. And as you can see, I'm losing edges here again. So instead of having lots of small highlights, I'm connecting all these shapes together to create one big lost edge, even into the contour. Now this just applies to the highlights, but of course there's another big edge that we might not always think about, and that's the edge of the hair against the background or the contour. Now for the contour of the face against the hair, I used a crisper edge or a harder edge. But of course the hair is soft, and so I want to show that to the viewer, and one way to do this is to make the contour nice and soft and fluffy. So for this again I'm using my blending tool, gently going over the outline to mush it up a bit with the background. As you can see, I'm not going over the whole thing completely randomly. I'm sort of following the lines that I make, but just fluffing them up a bit. And the more I do this, the more the viewer will understand the difference between the softness of the hair and the smoothness of the skin. Now, a last bias I want to talk about is making things symmetrical, and this can be a very strong bias. And this is because, again, our brains are looking for patterns in things that we see. We're trying to understand the world. But of course, the way hair falls isn't symmetrical. And it can be very hard to counteract that natural tendency. And one way, of course, is just to look at those shapes. And another way is to just make some slightly more random marks with your charcoal or your rubber, trying to make them as different as you can. And I've just done this in the contour, and as you can see, that gives a bit of variety. We've got some straighter lines at the top of the hair, then more zigzaggy lines in the middle, and then straight again at the bottom. So hopefully that's enough asymmetry and it feels natural that way. So let's push these concepts a bit further. The first concept I spoke about is the lost edge. So I'm going to see if there's areas in the hair that I can lose into the background using my rubber. I can also see if I can enhance that softness of the hair by softening the edges. And finally, I can add some more random shapes on top, as asymmetrical as I can, to emphasize this is not man-made, this is basically a natural way that the highlights are falling on top of the head. And this nicely suggests some texture as well. Same thing with the contour of the hair, near the side of the face, trying to add some lost edges there. And here you can spot that inherent bias of making things symmetrical. I'm trying to add some lost edges, but completely accidentally I make it very, very symmetrical to identical bumps there. So I've just got to go over that again, redo it, try to add that asymmetrical contour. That, to me at least, feels a little bit more natural now. And you may have noticed that I'm focusing mostly on the contour. I'm really not adding much information in the middle of the darks of the hair. And this is because most of the edge work is between light and dark shapes. And if I add a bunch of light shapes in the middle of the dark hair, the drawing can start to seem a little bit bitty. So instead I try to focus on the outlines and the contours instead. So we've got the highlights in the hair, the soft edges of the hair, and now I want to add the highlights in the face as well. And for this I'm just using my rubber, carving my lights into the grey of the paper that we established at the very start of the video. I always find it astonishing just how little information we need to really describe something. For instance, for the eyes here, I'm just using a little highlight for the top lids, and straight away the eye starts feeling more realistic. So less is more with these things. Now you may find that as you're working on these areas, we add more detail, you spot some small drawing mistakes. And that's just the way that drawing works. And you've got to trust yourself and know that you will fix these. So for instance, with the mouth now, I can see it's not quite in the right place. I'm not so happy with the shapes. And so I'm just adjusting these and taking the time to adjust them before I move on with the drawing. Now, of course, feel free to add some darker accents where you need them or want them in the drawing. But I do tend to be quite conservative with these, so I try not to do it too much. And this is because I want the focus to be on the hair and not too much on the face in this particular drawing. Of course, this may be completely different in the next drawing, so it's really up to us as artists what we decide is the focus of a drawing and what we decide to emphasize or de-emphasize. Now, because the hair is the focus, I want to add a few details in there. And like I spoke about before, I don't want to do this in the middle of the hair. So instead I'm looking at the contour, just adding a few nice lines to indicate strands of hair. Now I've chosen to really let the chin disappear into the hair to create more focus on the hair itself and less on the neck. But maybe this is a good place to add some really subtle tonal differences just to indicate that bottom of the neck or the chin into the rest of the hair. Now again, it's all about that contour and these edges or these transitions. So for the rest of the pose, I'm just gonna try and lose some of the contour by using my rubber, but also pulling out some details as well, all to give more focus to the hair. Alright, so that's the end of the pose. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed this focus on edges and on the hair. Now if you'd like to show us your work, feel free to use the photograph button in the bottom right corner of the chat. Or alternatively, you can use Instagram using the hashtag #RawUmberLife. Finally, if you've enjoyed this video and you'd like to join us more often, feel free to have a look at rawumberstudios.com/subscription.
I hope you enjoyed the session and thank you for taking part. Don't forget to post your works onto Instagram and hashtag them with #RawUmberLive. We run 2 sessions a week, a figure drawing session every Wednesday at 8 PM and portrait drawing every Sunday at 4 PM. The last portrait session of every month is free. Thank you and goodbye.